Что вам интересно собственный текст? Нет. Есть такое задание?
Шановні колеги, друзі, у нас одне з найважчих завдань вже в кінці поговорити на тему помилок. Мене звати Орися Луцевич, в мене сьогодні певне повернення додому, тому що я якийсь довший час працювала в Україні, потім працювала в Грузії, а зараз працюю в Лондоні з аналітичним центром, яким називається Chatham House. Мені дуже приємно, що мене запросили, і я почала таку невелику свою роботу з фактом в Україні в грудні минулого року. І зараз маю можливість брати участь у дуже цікавій конференції. В першу чергу, звичайно, дуже цікаво бачити знайомі обличчя і говорити про ті зміни, які відбуваються вже трошки більше ззовні. Я думаю, що ми будемо нашу розмову вести англійською мовою, оскільки наші всі доповідачі іноземці, так буде простіше, щоб не плутатись. Але перше, що я хочу сказати, ми хочемо максимально відкрити для аудиторії для запитань, тому що, мені здається, дуже багато людей припускають, що ми знаємо, які є попит. А мені здається, що важливо почути від аудиторії, які є попит на які запитання. So I will open our debate and I will ask the panelists to briefly make an introductory statement speaking about the mistakes, because as we say, you can learn much more from your mistakes than from your successes. So we would like you to reflect on some of the mistakes that happen in your region, in your organization, and then we will go through specific blocks of questions that are related either to the quality of research, or to the communication strategies, or to the governance and management of an institution. So I would like to ask Rosa to start.
Thank you very much. Is it on? Yeah?
No.
Yeah.
No.
You start speaking and it will turn on.
Oh, okay. Thank you very much.
No, it's not.
It's very embarrassing.
Nobody wants to hear about mistakes, okay?
I work in a think tank based in Brussels. I have worked in other think tanks in European Union member states.
Thank you very much. And basically, I have just 4 very brief messages about lessons learned. 4 points which I would have liked to have known when I started off in this career as a think tanker. The first point is know who you are. Whether you're a consultant, whether you're a political activist, whether you're a lobbyist, whether you're an NGO, the identity of the institute you're working for is actually very important and has quite a big impact. It's quite important in defining the business model of your organization, in making sure that your organization is transparent vis-a-vis the public, the general public, vis-a-vis your interlocutors, decision makers, policy makers, politicians, vis-a-vis your donors. I think also the identity of the organization also has an impact on the nature, the type of research that the organization is going to be carrying out, whether it's going to be more academic, whether it's going to be closer to, trying to establish a link between academia and the policy-making world, or whether it's actually going to be more policy-oriented and more journalistic, shall we say, more influencing the debate. And finally, the identity issue is also very much related to the sustainability in the long term of the organization. I have always worked in small organizations, and the financial dimension is crucial. So it is actually quite important in determining what kind of organization you will work in. Second point, invest in management skills. I wish I had known this before, especially now that the crisis is having a heavy impact on think tanks across Europe. Friends in other think tanks have seen or have had to sack people. This has not happened where I work yet, but it could happen. So actually management skills are quite important, and people like myself who come from having a rather good academic background are quite simply not taught to manage money, project, people. Third point, whatever we do, I think we always have to ask ourselves the question, who cares? So what? Why is my research relevant to the broader policy-making world, to the broader audience which we might reach through media, through communication strategy? I think to have research guided always by this question, why is what I'm doing relevant, is very important. And the final point, which has an impact, I think, on the quality, It's a bit, I suppose, off the wall. Read novels, be creative. Think about contamination between one area, which can be to do with a film that you saw, a novel you read, an art exhibition, and your work. There is a lot, because the think tank market in Europe is so competitive, there is a lot of running after the best brand, having the idea which is better than the other one, being more provocative with very little substance. Be thoughtful, be creative, come up with original ideas, and that's the best way to have a good message. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rosa. You told us what to be, but what not to be, you will tell us probably later a little bit. We'll see how it goes. Jacek.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for the invitation and this opportunity to share with you my reflections about basically learning from mistakes. And when I first heard that this session is supposed to be about mistakes rather than successes, I thought, you know, how refreshing, how wonderful. And then I started to think we got more specific questions that we are going to hear about specific examples of mistakes. And I was getting progressively less enthusiastic. And this is not because it's very difficult, because Polish think tank community is in such a great shape. However, it's not so much about, the story is not so much about particular concrete disasters or failures of think tanks. It's a story about problems that are in many cases similar to what I heard from today's discussion about Ukrainian think tank scene, about what I've read from the report, which I think is excellent and very thought-provoking. So I at some point I thought that I found myself in a situation of a character with one of William Shakespeare's play, which is Julius Caesar, and the character is Mark Antony, who is making a famous speech in this over the body of assassinated Julius Caesar, and he speaks. He says, "I have come to bury Caesar, not to praise him," and then he gives entire speech praising Caesar. So what I want to say is I'm not going to do the same. I'm not going to tell you about how wonderful Polish think tanks are, despite the fact that I was invited to speak about the mistakes. However, in these introductory remarks, I should say that Polish think tanks don't have a sense of a crisis. In fact, I recently did some interviews with a number of think tanks readers, and the crisis question was one of my first questions, and most of them were basically saying that it's a daily struggle, but it's not much worse than it used to be a couple of years before, and we don't expect things to get either much worse or much better in the future. So that's more or less the approach of Polish think tanks. And in fact, again, if you look at the big picture, you will see that we had to me, a bit surprising mushrooming of new think tanks in recent years. So in fact, you should be happy that the think tank community is getting larger. So there is potentially more supply in the policy research area. I would also say, even though there is not much research to support this claim, it's more of my own experience of running a think tank, that there is also more interest in what think tanks do from different types of clients, and in fact, more recognition what think tanks are. I mean, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, when I started in this business, I had a real problem telling people what I'm doing. Now this has changed. To some extent, it has changed because there was quite a lot of criticism of think tanks, how they are not contributing. So at least the word think tank has become more similar. So in a way, the lesson from this is that sometimes even critical discussion of think tanks can in a way help think tank community, because people started to recognize what you are doing, what you should be doing. So we should not always avoid this kind of critical inquiry and critical debate. But of course, the downside from this is that now we have more competition, more think tanks bidding or applying for limited numbers of sources of funding. And in fact, another picture, another characteristic of Polish think tank scene is that it's fiercely competitive, and there are at least two aspects of it. One is basically competition for funding, but also for ideas, who gets the best idea, the best project. And the second is the situation of political polarization in Polish political scene, and the fact that think tanks are finding it very hard to remain bipartisan because of the intensity of political debate, which I think many people outside of Poland may not realize, but it's a very divided political scene and quite divided think tank scene. So it makes it much more difficult to actually have all sorts of initiatives, like which were proposed in the report for Ukrainian, like building a guild of think tanks and so on and so forth. So that's probably one of the downsides. And just to finish, two or three more sentences, and maybe I will develop it later. I think that if we speak about mistakes of failures of Polish think tank community, I think that I would say that the biggest failure is the lack of preparation for changes, and especially the lack of generational change within think tanks on very many levels, in fact on every level: boards, management, researchers, communicators, and so on and so forth. And maybe I will develop it, but I just wanted to make it. I think it's a crucial challenge for not only think tanks in Poland, but for the whole NGO sector. And this is what I think we are not doing very well. So that's. I wanted to finish with the admission of mistake in a way.
We're not finishing yet. We're just starting,
Yes,
so
okay,
it's okay.
yes.
And I guess any PR is good PR is one of the, where negative can become positive. But Peter, could you please make your introductory remarks, and then we continue.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you for the organizers for having this really good event. I think it's thought-provoking, and the kind of self-reflection that it provokes, it's pretty important, I think, in the think tank scene. And I also really like this idea of thinking about the worst practices instead of the best practices, because it's much more interesting on the one hand. On the other hand, it's even more important in some points to think about the routes that should be avoided, and not just about the models that should be followed. And my think tank, Political Capital Institute, this is a Hungarian policy research and consultancy institute. So in the country where we are operating, at the first sight, you could think that the think tank scene is flourishing. There are a lot of political think tanks that are pretty active in the public. If you switch on the television at, let's say, 8 p.m. and just go through the news channels, you will find at least two political analysts belonging to one of the political think tanks that are commenting the events, or even have some debates on it. The political think tanks have a pretty big impact on, I wouldn't say the public opinion itself, but they are appearing in the public discourse pretty often, on the one hand. On the other hand, they are making pretty good revenues, I would say, compared to some other countries where the think tanks should just use a very limited amount of sources. So on the one hand, it should look flourishing. On the other hand, I would think that there are some really, really deep problems with the think tank scene in Hungary, especially with the political think tanks, because this is the think tank scene I see a bit better. And I wouldn't want to be too long at the beginning, so I would just expose two problems that are really, I would say, the poisons of the think tank scene in Hungary. One is the gravity of the political forces. And this is the point that Jacek was also talking about, the political divisions. But it's not just about the political and ideological divisions, because I think this is, from one hand, natural. I think that if somebody is working somehow in the political and policy field, it has its values, and its values can confront to other values. I think there is no problem with it at all in itself. But the problem is when the political parties are breeding the think tanks in order to support their views in the public, and this way some of the think tanks can be just found themselves in the role of the spokesperson, but not as a politician, but as a original independent intellectual. And this kind of political gravity is something that kills not just the neutrality of the statements and the political and policy analyses that they prepare, but also reduces the credibility of the think tanks, because all of the think tanks are surrounded by this kind of political suspicions. Who do you belong to? And the question is not that what are you saying, but who do you belong to? And this is sometimes, it makes it pretty difficult, and to reach out and to send more complex messages and more complex policy messages, for example, because the public is really not curious about it. The other problem, and it will sound strange, the overexposure in the media of the think tankers and the political think tanks. And it could sound strange because a lot of think tanks are just fighting to get to the media, to get some interest from the journalists. This is really not the case in Hungary, where the hunger of media for political analysts, who are sometimes just, let's say, duplicating the political debates, but on a bit more intellectual level, is huge. Politicians doesn't really like to debate in the TV show. Let's invite political analysts. One can belong to the right, one to the left, and then have some nice debates in the evening. And I think this kind of political overexposure, the misuse of the political analysts and the political think tanks by the media, by the really divided bipartisan, or not but partisan media, is something that also kills the credibility of the think tanks and makes it more difficult to drop some seeds of thought into the public that can really evolve in a more sophisticated and more complex debate on some specific issues, because everybody is just in the media is curious about short messages that fit to the position of a political party. So this is for beginning, and then the rest for the questions.
Thank you so much. I think you raised one of the very important points that links to the previous discussion, where we heard the representative of the president in the parliament speaking about more spin doctors or political technologies than independent think tanks. And I think this is the reality where we all should also distinguish the types of tanks: opinion tanks, political tanks, think tanks, independent tanks, because the environment that we are all working is not homogeneous. It's not so simple to qualify all. If you're registered as a think tank, you are a think tank. But Kova, we've heard from the representatives of more mature, I would say, political environment of decision making. At least that was one of the references to more mature. It's easier in a mature political decision making to impact policy making. How does it look from the Georgian perspective? What are the mistakes that you would like to highlight in the introductory remarks?
Thank you. I will also start by thanking organizers for giving me this opportunity to be here. It's a very interesting conference. Georgian political context, which is very, very important for policy context, obviously, changed significantly in less than 1 year. So this creates both opportunities and threats for think tank community, and I will talk a little bit, just the introductory remarks, what opportunities and challenges it creates, and then we will move to specifics. There are certain challenges, first of all, and these challenges are related to divisions. We moved from kind of one-party state to, by and large, bipartisan state by now. And what does it mean for think tank community? It means that the situation is becoming just like my colleague from Hungary described, bipartisan community that where each side has its own allies, and that creates, on the one hand, opportunity for think tanks to influence agenda and influence even policies, but at the same time it creates challenges for non-partisan organizations, and those organizations could be marginalized in this context, with all negative consequences that was also mentioned by Peter, attacking credibility of products that think tank community produces. So that's a big challenge that is brought by a very positive event, which is government change through elections in a competitive authoritarian settings. Another thing which is not related to political context but is challenging for think tank communities, that somehow, as I see it, think tank community is divided between policy relevant evidence collectors and interpreters of those evidences. By the way, I represent the organization who is mainly evidence collector. We are not that much into interpreting those evidences that we believe are policy relevant, but our worry and our frustration is that organizations who are less qualified in collection of evidences, instead of using evidence that are collected by professionals, are trying to create their own evidence in their own way, and often not in sufficiently sophisticated methodologies. And the challenge here I see is that instead of building good coalitions between evidence collectors and interpreters of those evidences, and then communicators of these evidences to policymakers, we all work in our own ways, and therefore our impact as a whole, as one sector, decreases tremendously. Last point I wanted to make is more general, and is about aims or objectives we set for ourselves. And I think it's sometimes problematic that we set objectives too ambitiously. Mostly, even small organizations aim at significant policy change, which is not realistic to my mind. And instead of doing that, I think more appropriate way would be to have kind of long-term objectives and kind of diversify the audience, instead of being kind of elite-oriented and working with politicians and working with policymakers. We should be working more with other groups, including general public, educating them or giving them information that either is not available for them or is available for public through politicians, which is always distorted according to political interests and needs. So just to summarize and end this on a positive note, change that we have in this country, in Georgia, change of government through peaceful elections, and kind of politically tense environment, I still believe that creates more opportunities than challenges for think tanks if they set objectives kind of modestly, will not try to achieve results immediately, because this is not realistic at all. And also, and if they start create coalitions between those who collect good evidences and between those who are good at interpreting and communicating those evidences. More specifics, I guess we will continue later. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Boba. But basically, from what I heard, is less is more. You have to be less ambitious in a sense, but clearly understanding your objective and audience. If I may just 1 minute to share my experience from my very little baby experience in being in a think tank. If I would like to say my mistakes, that when I was trying to write a briefing paper for Chatham House about civil society in Ukraine, I wanted to cover too much for the audience that was not too much aware of what I was trying to talk about, not in the Chatham House format, and giving some very specific recommendations which were not allowed in the briefing paper format. And I guess my mistake was also I could not really understand what is the tough quality control of the organization for this kind of publication and how many steps you have to go through and how much time it takes to have it all approved and published. So now maybe if we come back to some of the specific examples, if you have, from your experience or from your colleagues, or maybe be from your competitors, if it's easier for you to talk about their mistakes. It would be great if we have half an hour for questions. So perhaps I combine my question to all of you in one, and you choose which area you can cover best, whether it's related to the quality of research methodology, a flop, whether it's related to a communication strategy where you are trying to present some data in the society, but it was completely screwed, or it became very bad PR, or it became misinterpreted or used for whatever political reasons against you, or it is related to some of the metamorphoses that think tanks go through, because I think like any organization, it starts with one thing, then turns into something else, and maybe it's time to think that it's normal. It's evolution. Maybe it started as a sociological polling team, and then it turned into a political consultancy. Who knows? If it's driven by the market, anything is possible. So I would ask you to choose and say for around 3-4 minutes, 5 minutes maximum, about some of specific mistakes, and then we'll open the floor to the audience. Thank you. So whoever is ready to start. You're looking at me.
Okay. Now, I could have plenty of examples, and I could go on for this for a long time. But I think, and I'm not going to go into specifics, I'm not going to talk about my own institute, I'm not going to throw dirt on anybody else's institute, I don't think that's fair. But I think my point number 3, so what, who cares, perhaps is the most important one. I think, and this is particularly the case in Brussels, think tankers tend to be rather self-referential. Politics in Brussels tends to be rather self-referential. We kind of cheer each other up. We're all competitors because we're all competing for money. We're all competing for that space in the media. But at the end of the day, we're all friends. So it's not actually easy to handle that kind of competition, which is why I think one has to have one's own story clear from the beginning. Why is it that what I'm doing is relevant? And if it isn't, stop doing it. Find something else. Because there is a bit too much of following the flow, following the trend, and not setting the pace of the trend. We don't need to cover everything. I mean, I personally work in a generalist think tank. And I'm head of the international program. But when journalists were calling me up the other day saying what's happening in Mali, I referred them to other think tankers because I said, right now, I'm not following this. Go and call up Daniel Cohen from Fride because he knows about it. That's what I've been doing. You can't follow everything.
And don't pretend that you can.
Exactly. So I think follow the story that you think is good and ask yourself why that is relevant. That is the lesson that I will draw from experience.
Thank you, Rosa.
Just to follow up on both your questions and also what I ended with, the questions of quality of research, of communications, of management. I think they have one common denominator, and the failure in all these areas is generally a failure to build a strong institutional capacity in a think tank. And this may sound banal, but I think that if you look at the story of Polish think tank community, you will actually see a lesson for opportunities lost. Because the way I see this story is you have early 1990s and a bit later, where a lot of first generation independent think tanks were set up in Poland. And the typical story goes more or less like this. You have a bunch of people who very often were members of democratic opposition, then they had experience in the first reformatory governments, and then they found themselves out of the government and started a think tank. By the way, our Russian colleague said in the first session that Academy of Sciences was a kind of think tank for Soviet government. In Poland, actually, Academy of Sciences was a kind of think tank for democratic opposition, and so it was also a resource for future think tanks. So on one hand, you have this generation of people with good experience and very often quite charismatic persons who started to set up either think tanks or other types of NGOs. And at the same time, you have donor environment which was willing to, for example, give institutional grants and this kind of support, not project support, but institutional grants, and it lasted for several years. And now is the lesson learned, or perhaps a paradox of this story. At the time when think tanks had resources to build strong institutional capacity, and by this I mean in-house research capacity, build future leaders, future managers who will step in several years' time. They had institutional resources. They very much function as, I don't want to say vanity tanks as some people call it, but more of a convening platforms that these very charismatic leaders and very respectable persons often used to carry out certain important messages. And the typical functioning was very often that if research was done at all, it was commissioned from a very few recognized experts in the field who worked usually for several think tanks. And if there was any in-house personnel in think tanks, it was usually junior people who were supposed to just, you know, carry the suitcase, the case for those very high-level recognized experts. And once again, I think that many think tanks failed to use this time to prepare for the time when institutional grants will not be so easily available. And then if you want to continue to be a successful think tanks, and many of these think tanks were successful at the time. If you want to continue to be successful at the time when you will have to compete for funds, compete for project money, you will have to have a very strong team of people who are committed, well trained, and trained not only in research but also who will be recognized by the media as experts in their fields. And many of these think tanks, even the larger ones, were basically had only one face vis-a-vis the media, very often vis-a-vis the policymakers. That was the face of the leader. And again, I think this was, if we talk about lessons learned, this was a mistake that some of the think tanks did not start this preparing for the transition long enough, and didn't build the kind of image of an institution which has many experts who will be capable to contribute to either media discussions or talk to policymakers and so on and so forth. And of course, on top of that, you have the syndrome of think tanks which only want to address the government. And I think that now we are entering the phase of think tanks which realize that with all the arrival of the social media, it's not enough. You have to actually expand much more, not only through the existing media, but also through the new media. And again, the think tanks which started preparing for that much earlier, and this includes this generational change that is attracting people who have not been there when the wall was coming down, but much later generation. I think these think tanks were and are in a better position to compete in this new environment of social media. Okay, I'll finish at that.
Maybe there will be more questions.
So, okay. The examples I'm going to talk about, I would follow Rosa's line not to mention specific institutions, just in order not to use this occasion to discredit some of our...
Okay, well, if they are not Hungarian, we don't know them anyway.
Okay.
Don't worry.
So maybe...
And it can be on the Chatham House rule if you want.
Okay, I think, but not the players themselves who are so interesting, because it's rather symptomatic in terms of the systemic occupation of this think tank scene by political parties that I was mentioned beforehand. One of the examples I would mention is the example of a governmental close think tank that is receiving millions of euros funding from the government right now to make some policy researches and political researches, and even to comment in the media on an everyday basis and supporting the position of the government, being it anything. But this is what they practically receive the money for, and this organization in the last 1 year started to be afraid that because of the complete lack of credibility, everybody knows that they are one of the pro-governmental think tanks, and because of that, they have just only credibility on the side of the supporters of government. They try to shift in a more in a position that is more about the expertise and not just about the loyalty. So they try to build up a professional image, and they try to do it via their public opinion polls, because this is a think tank that is also doing some polls. This is the think tank of which results show that the government still has about 40% of support in the overall population. The rest of the pollsters says that they have around 25. So it's something really, really strange, really bizarre. It goes against the common sense on the one hand, on the other hand, all the other figures. And when they just bringing their results to the media, and in every public issue that the government supports, they have a public opinion poll that the public opinion supports what the government is doing. So they are just rather, I would say, making themselves more ridicule. They are ridiculing themselves with this kind of data. And when they are faced, for example, asked in the media that what is the reason for the difference between their polls and the polls of other institutions, it turned out that, for example, they have a very bizarre methodology for polling the party preferences. And this is that they make an open question. If there was an election next Sunday, which party would you vote for? What kind of relevance it has? Do you know any voting election systems? I'm personally not, where you are just getting a white paper and you should write up that which party you support for. I think there is no such an election system in the world. These elections in countries, and Hungary is such a country where there are party lists, are just based on a system that you get a list and you choose which party you prefer. And of course, if it's an open question, then a lot of respondents will just say the political party that is the most exposure in the media, this is the governmental party. So it can be one reason for the big difference between the results of this polling institute and the rest of the polling institutes. And I think this is a clear example. I would say, I don't know when the government change will be, but I'm pretty sure that if there will be a governmental change and this institution will get out of governmental funding, they will collapse completely because they are unable to build up their credibility, their expert image in a situation that they are paid for supporting the government's position. And of course, I have to say that this is not just so the bizarre situation that even the think tank scene and even the polling scene is a bit occupied by political parties is also reflected in some other really strange phenomena. For example, that one of the polling institutions that are pretty close to one of the opposition forces right now didn't have any kind of polls on a new emerging political party in Hungary, the ex-prime minister's political force, Gordon Banney's political force, because they said that this is not a party still. They are not official parties, so it's just a movement. How to put them on a list that is measuring the political party preferences? And of course, the reason was not that. The reason was that they were afraid that they will lose the funding from this other opposition party if they are polling something that shows that Gordon Banney, for example, is most popular than Attila Mesterházy, the other opposition leader. So I think if the pollsters and or the think tanks are so dependent from the political forces in terms of financing, I think it could easily lead to some practices that can discredit them and destroy their credibility, even if they have the knowledge and the expertise to do good researches. I was just talking about this issue with
Can you please summarize quickly, because we need to move on to questions.
Of course. With Goran yesterday, and Goran summarized it in a perfect sense. He told me that the Hungarian think tanks, most of them have good expertise and good technical skills, but they are in a lot of cases misuses them, and one of the reasons for that is that the political misuse that I was talking.
That is, I guess, they're following the market, of